Welcome to the Music Teachers in International Schools podcast. I'm your host, Chris Kulmer, and the MTIS is all about two things, really. Music teachers and international schooling. And we tend to spend most of the time on this podcast exploring the music teachers side of things. And we will explore that a bit today, but I wanted to focus more and dig deep on the concept of international schooling for the podcast today. One of the things that completely opened my eyes as an international school music teacher was when I spent some time trying to understand what an international school was. I started wondering things like, why are there so many international schools popping up around the world? Why do parents want to send their kids to international schools? Or what is the purpose of international schooling? Even what I thought was a seemingly simple question, what is an international school? I'll let that one percolate for a little bit because I think it's a great question. But through asking these questions and lots of reading, I came across the academic work of Dr. Denry Machin. I read lots of his work and eventually reached out to him some time ago to make a connection. We started some conversations. Denry answered some of my questions a bit. And here we are today, lucky to have Denry joining us on the podcast. So before we get into this conversation, let's learn a little more about our guest. Dr. Denry Machin was previously the head of upper school at Harrow International School Bangkok, moving from that post into a corporate new schools development role in 2012. For the last decade, he's been involved in international school development in China, Japan, Myanmar, South Korea, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and in the country he now calls home, Thailand. Denry left the Harrow fold in 2022 and is now an independent consultant. He has an MBA and a PhD and supports the University of Warwick with their Asia-based teacher training programs, including the new PGCE iQTS course, which I'm sure we'll get into a bit today. He is a governor of an international school in Malaysia, and he's a published author. His book, International Schooling, The Teacher's Guide, being part of what we're going to discuss today. So Denry, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Chris. Delighted to be here.
Let's start off with you telling us a bit about the book. Can you start off telling us why you wrote the book?
As forewarned, Chris, I'm going to turn it around a little bit and ask you some questions. I suppose there are two things here, but the first one is, why did you read the book?
Good question. The first time I saw the book, I feel like I actually saw a physical copy somewhere. I thought, oh, that's interesting, but I didn't read it. And then when I was starting to ask those questions around my first interest in international schooling, just generally, I was starting to ask those questions. But then when I started my PhD, I thought I really need to read this book to find out what it's all about. I think I read the cover or the back and was straight away intrigued by the breadth of it. You know, I thought I was going to read something. I actually didn't know what I was going to read, but I was struck by the breadth of it, and it just seemed to be the right thing for me to read at the time. And I think it was, because I really enjoyed it.
Right. Backing up a little bit there, we don't need to get into this, but you said you saw it and didn't buy it. From an author's point of view, with the first time you saw it from an author's point of view, that's a little bit of a worry.
Yeah, sorry about that.
I'm glad that you enjoyed the breadth, and clearly the cover at least grabbed your attention. The book was a response, as the dedication says, to all the questions that I've been asked over all of the years by all of the various teachers, either as a head of school or lecturing on MBA, PGCE, etc. I'd been asked an awful lot of questions, and an awful lot of questions repeatedly over those years. So kind of all of that material was in my head floating around. It had been various articles. And as people often say, it was a book that was in me that wanted to get out. It had reached that critical point where there was just all of this stuff inside me or stored on my computer that wanted to get out. And COVID afforded that opportunity, the space and time to write it. So it was kind of a COVID baby, I suppose. But that was why the book, the culmination of 20 years of being asked various questions about international schooling, and then COVID giving the time to write it.
When I did read the book, I was struck by your attempt to define international schooling. And I say attempt, but I thought it was amazing. I was like, this is a great definition. It really sort of rang true. And I really wanted to get you on the show to explore that definition. It's definitely the most useful definition I've found. I'm going to read the definition and then I'll ask you a question about it. So the definition of international schooling in the book is: an international school is one which provides a private, fee-paying education undertaken in schools declaring themselves international, whether implicitly or explicitly in their name or mission, and that's in brackets, attended by full-time students who study a curriculum, open bracket, at least in some substantive part, close bracket, that is not the national curriculum of the country in which the school is geographically located. And I'll make sure I put that definition in the show notes because it might be easy to read that as well. Denry, do you still stand by that definition? And if so or not, why?
In broad terms, yes. As we said underneath that definition in the book, any attempt at definition risks fingers wagged at exceptions. And I'm sure there are perhaps some of your listeners at the moment wagging their fingers, saying that that doesn't encapsulate my version of an international school. So broadly, with all the caveats that are encapsulated in that definition, yes, I do. But I'm sure we're going to get into unpacking that. I think we can go on that journey, but where I would like to come back to is why it matters. So perhaps of most interest to your listeners is why what an international school matters.
Do you want to have a go at answering that question? Why do you think it matters to have some kind of definition?
Outside of academic journals and PhD students who need to define it for their PhDs, and I guess for the companies that are trying to count the number of international schools, I'm not sure that it does matter. I think it only matters, it doesn't matter on a macro level. It doesn't matter globally what we define an international school as. You know, you could look at any category of other product, you know, a pair of trousers, a shirt, and there would be all sorts of variants of trousers and shirts within that. There's nothing that says a shirt must have X number of buttons and so on and so forth. But it matters perhaps to the individual. And I think that's also true of international schools. It matters in so much as that when people are applying to international schools for jobs, very often what they think they are applying to isn't what they find when they get there. So the label international school carries with it certain understandings, but those understandings may be unique to the individual, they may be unique to the country and that individual's understanding of the country. And so it matters when one comes to apply for jobs. What perhaps matters more is the type and tier of international school, not necessarily how it's defined. And we can get into the types and tiers as well. But I think those two things, type and tier, matter more than what we call an international school, unless you're writing for an academic journal, studying for a PhD, or trying to count the number of international schools. And I don't put much validity on that count anyway.
Are you referencing some of these research bodies that say there's this many international schools in the world, and you're like, oh, but what are you defining that as?
Yes. So that was the basis for the definition that we used in the book. So the definition itself is a hybrid of the definition that's used by the research companies so that they can bracket out what isn't an international school, i.e. those that they are not going to count. Some of the work done by Mary Hayden, Jeff Thompson, in terms of, defining the types and the tiers. Some in terms of, as it says, schools declaring themselves international. There is some research work out there that says simply, if an international school says it's international, it's international. We don't need to be any more specific than that.
Let's go to the types and tiers thing for a little bit. And you referenced the names Thompson and Hayden, who, if you type that in, international schooling, Thompson and Hayden, you'll find a whole bunch of references to their work. Can you give us a quick description of these types and tiers to your understanding?
So the types would be ideological, traditional, ideological, and then the newer type C, ostensibly what we call for-profit schools. So the type A traditional schools were those that were set up to serve the needs of globally mobile, largely expatriate populations. So these are the very, very long-served schools, the Tanglins, the Alice Smiths, the Bangkok Patterners, etc. And those schools, not entirely, the market has shifted, something we may get into, but they tend to retain a large portion of expatriate children. And many will have quotas on not having too many of any given nationality of teaching staff as well. So already we're starting to get into the why it matters. It doesn't matter whether that's an international school or not. It's that type of school. This is a traditional international school, perhaps with a larger proportion of expatriate children than is now common, and a more diverse staff than is common in other types of school. B is the ideological schools, so set up for particular ideological reasons. So the UWC group would be the poster child for ideological education, but there are lots and lots of others that would fall into that category.
Can I jump in on that? Are we talking ideologically international mindedness, global citizenship kind of ideas?
Not necessarily exclusively. The literature tends to lean in that direction, and just simply in terms of market growth, that was where the majority of the growth was in schools of that nature. So the original traditional schools grew up because there was a demand for schooling for children not of that country as they moved around the world. Ideologically, as the first wave of globalization, and we started to need to think about things like international mindedness. But those schools could be ideological in that they have sustainable. So the philosophies, Green School Bali, one could argue is perhaps type B ideological. Schools with a religious basis could be type B ideological. And again, immediately we're seeing how it might matter to teachers beyond the definition in a textbook or an academic journal, why the types of schools matter, because a lot of teachers do prefer to work in schools where the ideology of the school matches their own ideology. And at type C are the more recent, predominantly for-profit schools, the branded schools, Harrow being one example, that have largely fueled the growth in international schooling since about 96, 97.
The tiers?
So the tiers is much more amorphous, and this frustrates teachers because they imagine, particularly teachers new to the industry, imagine, because of the talk of tiers, they imagine that somewhere out there is a codified list of which schools are in what tiers and what it takes to be in a different tier. So you either talk about upper tier, mid tier, lower tier, or tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and that's quality. But it is perceptions of quality. It's potentially hearsay, rumor. It's the stories that the schools tell about themselves. So it's perfectly possible that a tier 2 school, perceptually, as far as the teacher market is concerned, starts to tell stories of itself as a tier 1 school, and thus changes those perceptions of its tiering without actually changing anything fundamental in the way that it does schooling. So these things are very, very subjective, and they change over time, often with changes in leadership structure, etc. So, but tier 1 would tend to be larger schools, a little bit more established. It is possible for new schools to come in and be immediately perceived as tier 1. It's a little bit rarer. It tends to take a few years for schools to find their teeth. Tier 2 would be the mid-tier, middle market fee schools, and then tier 3 would be the lower fee, lower quality of facilities schools.
And just to clarify, so there is no document to say this is what a tier 1 is. This is purely perceptual.
Yes, perceptual and subjective, almost down to the individual level. As it says in the book, it's the stuff of staff room and after work drinks conversations, or Facebook forums as people are talking about moving to new schools. One will see and hear the schools being talked about as tier 1, tier 2, upper tier, mid tier, etc. And again, as we're at pains in the book to point out, it doesn't necessarily mean, this goes back to ideology and individual teachers' ideology, tier 2, mid-tier is not necessarily pejorative. There are some very, very good, perceptually mid-tier schools out there that may be perfect better even for a given teacher than working in a supposed tier one school. One could work in a tier one school and have a horrible experience, and it's perceived as tier one because of the brand name, because of the quality of the facilities, because of a whole host of factors, the type of children that attend there, that just simply the level of the fees. But actually, it isn't a good experience for that particular teacher. And many are better off at tier two schools or even tier three schools.
Wow. I think that's a really interesting point. And this sort of discussion, you're right, it does just pop up, like you said, in the staff room. Oh, we're a tier two school. And you're like, well, where does that language come from? Where have you, how have you created that idea? Yeah, okay.
And I think it would be interesting to do the research on this. To some extent, it will be reflected in salaries. However, salaries and quality of the school does not necessarily correlate. I'm not saying that they don't, but I'm saying that we can't draw that conclusion. So there are multiple facets to the way that this tiering is done. Teachers may talk about a school being a tier one school simply because it has better salaries and benefits, independent of the quality of that school as an educational institution. It may be an excellent educational institution, but that's not what the teachers mean when they're talking about it being a tier one school. Or it may pay high salaries, but actually not be particularly strong as an educational institution at that moment in time, for whatever reason.
So just going back one step, the types. So we have the types and the tiers. The types is the work of a few academics, but Hayden and Thompson.
Hayden and Thompson, yeah.
And the tiers, we don't know of any research in that area specifically.
I am not aware. I'm aware of papers that have talked about it.
Yes.
And there is an increasing body of work that talks about institutional legitimacy, which touches on those tiers. But I'm not aware of any attempts to codify that tiering.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine that the schools would be willing to engage in that research. It's something that I've thought about myself. It would be very, very difficult to do. It's very difficult to capture that data on a global basis across enough schools. One would have to do it via individual teachers, one imagines, because the schools are not going to necessarily volunteer that data. Those that are sure that they would come in as tier one may well, but for the rest, the turkeys are unlikely to vote for Christmas.
Yeah, well put, fair point. So you mentioned before the increase in the number of for-profit institutions. International schooling has evolved, right, over the last 100 years or so. From your current understanding, research, could you give us an outline of any other major movements, developments that you're aware of in international schooling?
All sorts, and I guess it depends whether we're talking educationally or in terms of the overall market. I would suggest for me, my interest is in the market, not that I'm uninterested in the education that's going on in the schools. It's simply that my research has been into the economics and business side of schooling. That was my background originally as a business studies and an economics teacher, hence that interest. Most recently, there has been a move towards more bilingual schools, and not unrelated to that, an expansion in the mid-fee and lower fee schools. I'm being careful there not to associate that with tiering, simply there the fee levels. And I think that's because the growth post 96 that accelerated in the late 2000s, particularly, and especially so with the growth in British branded schools, notably in China, but throughout Southeast Asia in general, they were often premium schools with premium fees, riding on the back of growth in global middle classes. In a number of markets, the growth in the upper middle classes has slowed, and the middle classes are now growing to a greater extent at the lower end. And the new international schools are catering, some new international schools are catering for those lower middle classes, rather than was originally the case, if we rewind back, say, 20 years, for the upper middle classes. So it is more likely now, and I speak mainly here of Southeast Asia, China to some extent. The Middle East is slightly different. It is more likely that a new school opening up would be potentially bilingual and potentially have more moderate fees than was the case 10, 15 years ago. And again, your listeners are probably wagging their fingers, pointing at exceptions. I'm talking in general terms across the market here, not in individual cities. I can think of counterexamples in Bangkok, premium schools that are looking to set up in Bangkok, a city that ostensibly would be saturated with premium and super premium schools, and yet they're still looking to enter.
Just out of interest, because I've looked into the context of Malaysia where I was previously working, do you know how many roughly international schools are in Thailand or Bangkok or maybe even Thailand?
So the last I looked, it was about 115 in Bangkok and over 200 in Thailand.
Yeah, wow.
But again, that speaks to the nature of the market, that that we see the tip of the iceberg, and the tip of the iceberg are the shiny big schools, and I'm using air quotes here, the top 5, and they are the schools that people talk about. But of those 200 schools in Thailand, the vast majority are mid or lower tier. The vast majority are sub-premium fees. I guess that's looking at the Premiership and judging all football by the Premier League, when actually underneath the Premier League, there's an awful lot of football happening.
Yeah, good analogy. You've mentioned your research and your interest in the market of international schooling. Can you just give us a bit more of an outline of your PhD? What did you study and what were some of your findings?
Yeah. So actually, the PhD was very different to that. And this relates back to the definition of international schooling. And there's a cautionary tale here for you as well, Chris. So all of that stuff was one chapter in my PhD. So of 90,000 words, it might have been 10 or 15. But actually, it's the chapter that has generated the most interest and the most papers postdoc. So my PhD, I will read you the title, was actually Managerialism in International Schools, a critical inquiry into the professional identity work of head teachers. So the theoretical basis, if you like, was managerialism and identity work. So what I was looking at was how heads of school identify how they cope in terms of their self-identification, not necessarily occupationally, not how they do the job, who they see themselves as being. So that's the identity piece. So it was framed in, these people are educationalists. They've grown up professionally through the classroom. They cut their teeth at the chalk face, and then they move into management roles. Those management roles being increasingly managerial. Managerial would basically mean management to excess, efficiency for efficiency's sake. The bottom line becoming far more than just educational. So in that environment, how do heads self-identify in an environment whereby they are expected to engage with managerialism, not just managerialism, to a greater and greater extent?
Yeah, so I'm sort of picturing, as a teacher, you're looking at your head teacher and you're thinking, they're dealing with all this management stuff and they're also dealing with classroom stuff. And where's that balance for them? Where do they identify? Do they identify more with all the managerial stuff, or do they still feel that identity in the classroom? Is that kind of...
So basically, yes. So, and again, this is a note of warning for you. When people ask you to sum up your PhD findings almost into sort of 90-second sound bites, it can be very difficult. And you think, crikey, I spent 2.5 years on that work, and tell me what you studied in 2.5 years in 60 seconds. So the way that I addressed that is I came up with a number of categorizations. And so at the base of those categorizations was a head who would identify as a teacher head. So they see themselves first and foremost as a teacher. They are a teacher first and a head second. And so in the interviews I did, the kind of things that they'd be saying is, I want to be in the classrooms. I want the chalk dust under my fingers. That's where I feel most alive. I have to do the management stuff, but I don't really like it. They would be a teacher head. The next categorization was a head teacher. And that reversal is significant. So we've gone from teacher head to head teacher. So the head teacher sees themselves as the head of the teachers. They're still a teacher and they still identify as a teacher, but they've ontologically in terms of their identity. They've accepted a slight shift in their identity, and that they accept that they are the head of the teachers. And that categorization went all the way up to what I called the educational executive. And the educational executive saw no division between their role as an educationalist and a manager. It's just the job. It doesn't matter for them which bit they're doing. They just enjoy doing the job. And you could argue that at that level, it's a place where they, similar to CEOs of companies, they could manage any company. The product matters less. I'm not saying these people had abandoned education, but you'll often get people at the top of corporations who haven't come up through the ranks of that corporation. Their skill is in management and leadership. And a lot of the educational executives saw themselves in those terms. They hadn't quite abandoned their educational identities, but those educational identities sat alongside an ability to be a manager without seeing any conflict in the managerial stuff.
Got ya. Wow.
Those examples were rarer. So one of the quotes was somebody said, "Knowing what's going on, being comfortable in both worlds strengthens my hand in all sorts of ways." So what they were talking about was the ability to use managerialism, and managerialism as distinct from management, to use managerialism as they saw it to improve the organization. And the debate is to the extent to which managerialism actually improves the organization. But that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think we get the gist, and I'm sure listeners will be thinking in their context how that might apply, and I like it. Really good. So let's talk a bit more about some other things I mentioned in the intro, because like you said, we could probably go really deep on that whole conversation. We've recently had guest Yan Jiao on the show, and he was episode 22. And Yan is a legend. He's a good friend of mine, and I was really happy to have him on the show. And he was an example of something we get a lot in the MTIS community. So we're bringing the music back into the conversation here straight away. He's this sort of one-to-one music teacher working as a instrumental teacher essentially, and has transitioned into a classroom music teacher. And he did that through his IPGCE through Warwick University. Can you maybe give us a bit of an idea of what that is, the Warwick IPGCE? Because I know people in the community will be interested. And what might be some of the key reasons people might choose Warwick for that qualification?
I remember Jan well. So I think it must have been during COVID when he did it. So he and I sat in virtual rooms like this on Thursday evenings for both of us quite a few times as I was guiding him through that. The PGCI question is one that, as the saying goes, if I had £1 for every time I answer the PGCI question, I would be long since retired.
And can I just jump in? Is it PGCI or IPGCE? Or doesn't it? You can answer that later.
No. In those terms, different universities call it different things.
Okay.
So for Warwick, it is the PGCI. Other universities would put the I in front of the PGCE. It doesn't matter. It doesn't make any difference. Those conversations have been a little bit overtaken by the introduction of, and this is going to confuse things even further, PGCE, iQTS. And in that case, the I is divorced from the PGCE and is attached to QTS, which is a whole other conversation, and another one which I've got £1 for every time I've asked questions about it.
And should we quickly just break apart the acronyms for a second? So what is PGCE and what is QTS?
Yeah. So PGCE, Postgraduate Certificate in Education, QTS, Qualified Teacher Status.
Yep.
So I graduated from the UK teacher training. My undergraduate degree is in business management. So I had to do a postgraduate teacher training qualification. That postgraduate teacher training qualification in the UK is the Postgraduate Certificate in Education. Postgraduate certificates in education are usually, and it has changed over the years, coupled with QTS, Qualified Teacher Status. So as part of your postgraduate 1-year teacher training course, for those that have got subject specific degrees. It's a little different if you have a bachelor's in education. They obviously often come with QTS. In principle, the same. I just had to do an extra year on top of my degree because it was subject specific. The PGCE bit is the academic element of the qualification awarded by the university. So master's level, different courses carry different amounts of credits. Some are 60 credits, some are 90 credits, but that is an academic certification. You do a number of essays. Again, it will differ by provider, but you do a number of essays and you would be awarded a postgraduate certificate in education. Alongside that, not always, but alongside that, most people also do QTS. In order to get QTS, you need to do a requisite number of days and hours in schools on a teaching practicum. In the UK, that would be 2 different teaching practicums. And so you graduate from your PGCE from the university and get QTS awarded by the Department for Education in the UK, broadly, for simplicity, at the same time. Though, like I say, that has changed over time and there are other issues involved with that. But that is the process. Overseas, that became the IPGC PGCI, which didn't accrue QTS. So a graduate like Jan of Warwick's PGCI has exactly the same academic credits as I do, having done a PGCE, sorry, I'm tripping myself up with the letters. He has exactly the same academic qualification as I do, but because he did his internationally and pre-iQTS, he didn't get those additional letters. And this is where your question about Warwick, not all providers of PGCIs require a teaching practice. Warwick is one of the universities which does, and Warwick's is a robust and rigorous teaching practice assessed to the same standards and with broadly the same requirements as would be the case for somebody doing a PGCE in the UK. So whilst Jan doesn't have those letters after his name, in essence, one, by virtue of his prior experience, he was already working in schools. So whereas I had to do, I was 22 at the time, and I had to do a first placement in a school, Jan had already spent a long time teaching in schools as a peripatetic music teacher and gained that initial experience. And then he did the extended teaching practice, graduating with a PGCI. Since then, the UK government, the DfE, has introduced iQTS. So iQTS is now being offered, again, usually in combination with PGCEs. iQTS requires a longer teaching practice. So for Warwick, it's 120 days versus 90 days for the PGCI. And the requirement for the amount of hours that one teaches is also greater towards the end of that 120 days. So iQTS even more closely mirrors the practice of studying for and doing the teaching practice for PGCE iQTS in the UK. There are a variety of other criteria as well for getting onto PGCE iQTS that are different to the PGCI. So PGCE iQTS has become the gold standard. So for anybody wanting the best type of qualification available in the market at the moment to give them the fullest access to international schools, subject to having the prerequisite qualifications, being able to meet the prerequisite requirements, subject to having a suitable school and a suitable mentor, etc., that would be the gold standard. iQTS can be converted to QTS for anybody who may want to teach in the UK in the future. The pilot cohort are just about graduating now, so that iQTS to QTS conversion process hasn't happened yet, at least. So we will find out more when this cohort graduate, get their certificates, and attempt to go through that process.
Firstly, well done on all the acronyms. You nailed it. And
but one slip up.
One slip up. Oh, I didn't hear it. One clarification is, so the course is completely online in terms of content delivery, but there's obviously an in-person practice teaching period, which you said has different number of hours depending on the qualification. Is that correct?
Post-COVID, yes. Again, that's I can only speak for Warwick there. Some providers do have face-to-face residentials. Warwick did pre-COVID, and we hosted them in Bangkok. Students used to come here for a week. We talked about offering that again, but actually people prefer an online induction week. And so for Warwick, again, one of the things that makes Warwick different is Warwick has fortnightly workshops. They're Thursday evening, where I was meeting Jan. So for the duration of the course, there are fortnightly workshops, which are also all online. So there's been a definite shift towards, for obvious reasons, online delivery. For example, for this coming year, Warwick offered both the PGCE and PGCE iQTS students the option of either face-to-face or online moderation tutor visits. So a moderation tutor visit would be where somebody external, me, for example, goes into the school, sits at the back of the class, observes the lesson, talks to the mentor, verifies that what the mentor has been saying in terms of that trainee's quality is true, fair, and accurate. During COVID, obviously, we were forced to do those remotely and online. So that has now become an option. And at the moment, for the August 2023 cohort, so the new cohort that will start this year, about 80% of the students are opting for online moderation tutor visits. I still think, and I've written about this, I can give you the link, the PGCI is still a valid course for many, many people. So what both courses will do is give you the right piece of paper, the right certificate in order to get a work permit and associated visa in the vast majority of countries globally. If one is a teacher with no aspirations to ever teach in the UK and no aspirations to teach, and here we go back to the tiers, no aspirations to teach in the upper tier schools that require QTS and may or may not accept iQTS, the jury's out on that until this cohort start to apply. If you are a teacher that doesn't intend to apply to upper tier, nor to ever to return to the UK or air quotes the West, the PGCI is a perfectly valid course. It will get you the piece of paper and in turn the teaching license, and you will do that at less cost than going through PGCE iQTS. PGCE iQTS is the gold standard. It is more expensive, it's more rigorous, but isn't necessarily the right qualification for everybody.
Cool. Anything else you sort of wanted to add about the course before we move on? Because I was getting excited about the next question, which is I'll get to in a second.
a music question. No, I think that's it. Like you say, I can give you some links to various things that I've written on that. It is complicated, and everybody's individual situation is different. So it often takes, which is in essence kind of what I do for Warwick, working through with individuals what the right course for them to do is. It can take quite a bit of work with an individual as they think about what's best for their career, what they can afford, what's best for them over the long term, etc.
Yeah. And I really value going into detail on this because, like you referenced with your book, it's amazing how often at MTIS we get this question: what qualification should I do? And what does this mean? And what does that mean? So I think it was really valuable to spend time on that. Okay, music. Can you tell us a bit about music for you? I mean, the listeners are probably going like, this guy knows
where's
lots
the music
of stuff.
in this music podcast?
What is your background with music? I don't even think we've talked about it just in sort of pre-recording the podcast conversation. Yeah. What was your background?
Shamefully, very little. I learnt trumpet as a year 7 for about 10 minutes until my parents got annoyed with the sound of a 11-year-old trying to learn the trumpet. So shamefully, very little. Although I was a professional DJ for a number of years.
Ah, there we go.
But that I'm not sure that counts as music. That's basically playing other people's music.
Oh, the finger waving is going to be going crazy right now because we have many a person in this community that would be saying 100% that is music. You are manipulating music and you're a complete musician. Obviously, there's a different nuance to that conversation.
Yeah, I would like to think so. This would be a whole other conversation about the the art of DJing and the state of dance music and DJing today. When I was DJing, it was more common, and this is going to sound terribly pretentious, it was more common to play music tunes that were longer and to stay in the mix for much, much longer. So what you say, the musicality of being in the mix potentially for 2 minutes, where what you're playing is therefore unique and you are interpreting the blending together of those two different songs. Yes, that has waned significantly. And there'll be DJs listening to this, music teachers wagging their fingers that it isn't the case. Again, there will be exceptions, but the art of DJing, because of digital music, one doesn't need to stay in the mix for 2 minutes to make sure that the music is beat matched.
In the mixes, you're in your headphones listening to get your tracks beat matched.
So apologies. So in the mix would mean that you're playing both tunes live to the audience. So you might be in the mix a few bars before you open both tracks to the audience, just as you get them beat matched. But it is, so in the mix would be the transition point where the audience is hearing both tracks. So when you're in a nightclub and you hear one track going out and you hear hints of the next track coming in, and you're, oh, what's that coming in? I can hear something new, or I recognize that. That's in the mix. And that used to be you would be doing that for a lot longer, because when it was turntables, the turntables didn't beat match for you, and there was a lot of variability that they would be changing, going in and out of match constantly. So you needed longer to transition from record to record. You don't need that anymore. The decks will auto beat match for you, and therefore you can transition from tune to tune much more quickly. So it reduces the musicality of mixing. And I'm not saying all DJs are guilty of that, but it potentially reduces the musicality of DJing.
So from trumpet playing for 10 minutes to then professional DJ, how did you make that transition? What got you into DJing?
Raving as a kid. I'd always been into dance music, and it was the kind of thing that, bedroom DJing when we were young teenagers with various friends. And then it was kind of in my mid to late 20s, kind of having played with it for a while, I just decided, in fact, I saw a kid at school. It was a school event, and there was a kid doing a DJ set, and I was appreciating what this kid was doing, enjoying what he was doing, curious about what he was doing. And I can remember standing there thinking, I should do it. Before I get too old, I should properly commit myself to actually learning how to do it properly, putting the time and effort into learning to do it. So I did.
Love it. That's so cool.
Now far too old and retired from it. Starting work at 1 a.m. was a challenge.
Do you still have gear, decks, anything?
It's sitting over there. Yes. It occasionally gets dusted off. It takes a tune to spark me to want to play it. So actually that happened the other day. Not particularly because it's Robbie Williams, but Robbie Williams is in a new group band. I'm not sure what we'd call it, playing electronic music. And I heard that tune and I thought, oh, that will sound very good through my monitor speakers. So I played it through those, and it's that kind of moment that catches me, and then I find myself having a little play. I guess that's very similar to somebody who's got a guitar in the corner of the room. They'll hear something, they'll hear some chords, and that will inspire them to pick up their dusty guitar and have a little strum.
Nice. So I guess my final question, as an international school leader, what is your perspective on the role of music in an international school, or music education rather, in an international school?
That's got an easy answer and a difficult answer. So critical and crucial, and an integral part of what a school, and I'm deliberately dropping the word international there, what a school offers both to its children individually and to the school community collectively. The harder answer is that an awful lot of subjects would make claim to that as well. But I don't suppose it's mutually exclusive. Just because one can say that about music doesn't mean that one can't necessarily say it about other subjects. But I think music is and should be more than just the shiny tentpole events. Some of the schools that have got the best music programs will have small scale lunchtime concerts in the walkway or outside the dining room, where bands, groups, quartets are putting in the hours and practicing and entertaining the masses. And it isn't a giant showpiece event. And it's that kind of thing that makes music part of the DNA of a school, rather than those big tentpole events where it's the elite musicians who are seen on stage. For me, a healthy music program has to have those kinds of aspects, as well as the big tentpole events.
Denry, we probably could have dived down a whole bunch of directions in this conversation. Is there anything else you wanted to say? Any further thoughts, questions, comments that we didn't quite touch on?
At risk of running over time, probably not, or at risk of jumping down those rabbit holes, at least we managed to get to music. So for the listeners that stayed with us through all of the managerialism and the academic stuff about what is an international school, at least they got to some music at the end.
Yeah. And I think it was great. I mean, I was almost going to ask you, can we just get the decks out and can you play for us? But then we would be here for a couple of hours. So maybe next time.
They're not quite within reach.
Yeah. Thanks so much for taking the time and for taking us on the journey and giving us all of your kind of insight from years in international schools, the research, the time now as a consultant and working with schools and building schools. I really appreciated it. And like I said in the intro, I came across your work early. And so for me to be able to speak to you and to be able to share your knowledge with the audience was really exciting. So thank you, and looking forward to staying in touch and hearing more of your insights and writings in the future.
It's been a delight to share. Thank you for having me, Chris.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Music Teachers in International Schools podcast. Listen to other episodes by visiting mtiis.com or learn more about our community on Facebook by simply searching for Music Teachers in International Schools. If you know someone who you think I should get on the podcast, I'd love to hear from you. You can find me at chriskoelma.com, ChrisKoelma.com. See you next time.